In the affluent neighborhood of Willowbrook, where manicured lawns and pristine homes create an image of suburban bliss, the Stevenson family stood out as the epitome of success and happiness. Emily Stevenson, a 42-year-old housewife, was admired for her beauty and social grace. Her husband, Richard Stevenson, was a successful investment banker whose career provided them with a life of luxury. Together, they were the picture-perfect couple, envied by many in their community. But beneath the surface, their marriage was far from perfect. Over the years, the bond that once held them together had weakened. The laughter that used to fill their home had faded into silence, replaced by the cold indifference that now defined their relationship. Richard, ever consumed by his work, had become distant, leaving Emily to navigate her days alone in their lavish home. Emily had everything she could ever want, except the emotional connection she craved. Her days were filled with charity events, lunches with friends, and managing their household, but none of it could fill the void left by Richard's absence. The love that had once burned brightly between them had dimmed to a flicker, and Emily found herself longing for something more. It was during this time of loneliness and dissatisfaction that Emily met Mark Reynolds, a 30-year-old fitness trainer who had recently started working with clients in Willowbrook. Mark was everything Richard was not: attentive, charismatic, and full of energy. He had a way of making Emily feel seen and appreciated, something she hadn't felt in years. Their sessions together started innocently enough. Mark would come to the house to train Emily in their home gym, guiding her through exercises and offering encouragement. But as the weeks went by, their interactions became more personal. Mark would listen as Emily confided in him about her frustrations and loneliness, offering her the attention and empathy she so desperately needed. Emily found herself drawn to Mark in a way that went beyond physical attraction. He represented the excitement and passion that had been missing from her life for so long, and Mark, captivated by Emily's sophistication and beauty, was equally drawn to her. Their connection grew stronger with each passing day, setting the stage for a relationship that would change their lives forever. As summer approached, Emily and Mark's relationship took a turn from professional to personal. What began as harmless flirtation quickly escalated into a passionate affair. The thrill of their secret meetings brought a new sense of vitality to Emily's life. For the first time in years, she felt alive, intoxicated by the excitement of being desired. Their affair was conducted with the utmost secrecy. Emily knew the risk she was taking, but the thrill of their stolen moments outweighed her fear of being caught. She would invite Mark over during the day while Richard was at work, making sure that their encounters were brief yet intense. Each meeting left Emily yearning for more, while Mark found himself increasingly consumed by his feelings for her. Emily was careful to maintain appearances in public. To the outside world, she was still the perfect wife, attending social events and hosting gatherings at their home. But beneath the surface, she was living a double life, one that brought both exhilaration and anxiety. The routine days were now filled with anticipation as she counted down the hours until she could see Mark again. However, the excitement of the affair came with a price. Emily began to notice changes in her behavior: nervousness, restlessness, and an ever-present sense of paranoia. She found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, terrified that someone might discover her secret. Richard's occasional questions about her day, once easily dismissed, now felt like veiled accusations. Richard, though preoccupied with his work, was not entirely oblivious. He noticed a change in Emily: her distant gaze, the way she seemed distracted, the sudden burst of energy that appeared out of nowhere. But rather than confront her, he chose to dismiss it as stress or boredom. After all, he was too focused on closing deals and managing clients to pay much attention to his wife's inner turmoil. Despite the growing tension, Emily couldn't bring herself to end the affair. The thought of returning to her old life, devoid of passion and excitement, was unbearable. Mark had become her escape, pulling her out of the monotony and loneliness that had once defined her existence. But with each passing day, the weight of their secret grew heavier, and the cracks in Emily's perfect facade began to show. As the summer wore on, the strain of living a double life began to take its toll on Emily. What had once been a thrilling escape was now a source of constant anxiety. The balancing act between her roles as a dutiful wife and a passionate lover was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Every glance from a neighbor, every casual conversation with a friend, felt like a potential threat, a crack in the carefully constructed facade she had built. Richard, though still engrossed in his work, sensed something was amiss. Emily's erratic behavior was becoming harder to ignore. She was distracted during their conversations, often lost in thought or overly eager to change the subject. When he inquired about her day, she seemed to be avoiding him, finding excuses to be out of the house or busy with activities that had never interested her before. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, Richard noticed the subtle changes in Emily's demeanor. She was unusually quiet, pushing her food around on her plate without taking a bite. When he asked if something was bothering her, she smiled weakly and assured him that everything was fine. But Richard wasn't convinced. There was a distance between them that hadn't been there before, a growing chasm that he couldn't ignore. Richard's suspicions grew as the weeks passed. He began to notice small things that didn't add up. Emily's unexplained absences, her sudden new interest in fitness, and her frequent mention of Mark Reynolds. It was all too coincidental. Richard's mind began to race with possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. Unable to shake his suspicions, Richard decided to confront Emily one evening after dinner. He approached the subject carefully, not wanting to accuse her outright, but needing to understand what was happening in their marriage. As they sat in the living room, the tension between them palpable, Richard finally asked, "Emily, is there something you're not telling me? You've been distant lately, and I can't help but feel like there's something going on." Emily's heart raced as she tried to maintain her composure. The question she had been dreading had finally come. She forced a smile and responded, "Richard, I've just been under a lot of stress lately. With everything going on, I guess I've been a bit off. But there's nothing to worry about." But Richard wasn't satisfied with her answer. He pressed further, his voice tinged with frustration. "Emily, I know something is wrong. You're not yourself. If there's anything you need to tell me, now is the time." The pressure was too much. Emily felt the walls closing in on her, the secret she had been guarding so fiercely threatening to spill out. But she couldn't bring herself to admit the truth. Instead, she deflected, assuring Richard once again that everything was fine, that he was just imagining things. But Richard knew better. He could see the fear in her eyes, the way her hands trembled as she spoke. The doubt in his mind had grown into certainty, and he realized that whatever was happening, it was far more serious than he had initially thought. The seeds of mistrust had been planted, and they would soon grow into something much more dangerous. As Richard's suspicions deepened, Emily's paranoia escalated. She became more careful, more guarded, trying desperately to keep the affair hidden. But the more she tried to cover her tracks, the more erratic her behavior became. She was unraveling, and both she and Richard knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. In the midst of this growing tension, Emily and Mark continued their affair, though it was no longer the carefree, passionate escape it had once been. Now it was tinged with fear and desperation. Emily clung to Mark as her lifeline, but the joy she had once found in their relationship was fading, replaced by the looming dread of being discovered. The cracks in Emily's life were widening, and the weight of the lies she had told was becoming unbearable. The strain was taking its toll on her health, her marriage, and her sanity. And as Richard's determination to uncover the truth grew stronger, the stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything. The tension in the Stevenson household reached a breaking point on a sweltering afternoon in late July. Richard had spent the morning in his office, his mind racing with thoughts of Emily and the growing distance between them. He could no longer ignore the gnawing suspicion that something was terribly wrong. Determined to uncover the truth, Richard made a decision that would set off a chain of events from which there would be no return. Earlier that day, Emily had arranged to meet Mark at their home gym, as they had done so many times before. But this time, it was different. The usual excitement and anticipation were overshadowed by a sense of foreboding that Emily couldn't shake. The fear of being caught had grown too intense, and she found herself questioning the affair that had once brought her so much joy. Mark arrived at the house, greeted by an unusually nervous Emily. She ushered him inside, her eyes darting around as if expecting Richard to appear at any moment. But Richard wasn't supposed to be home. At least, that's what Emily thought. As they made their way to the gym, Emily tried to push the fear aside, but it clung to her like a shadow. As they began their workout, the conversation was strained, lacking the light-hearted banter that had once characterized their sessions. Mark noticed Emily's anxiety and tried to reassure her, but his words did little to ease the tension. Both of them knew that they were playing a dangerous game, and the stakes were higher than ever. Unbeknownst to them, Richard had made the decision to leave the office early. His thoughts had been consumed by the nagging feeling that Emily was hiding something from him, and he could no longer focus on his work. He needed answers, and he was determined to get them. When Richard pulled into the driveway, he immediately noticed Mark's car parked on the street. A surge of anger and suspicion coursed through him. Without thinking, he stormed into the house, his mind racing with the possibilities of what he might find. The house was eerily quiet as Richard made his way through the rooms, his footsteps heavy on the hardwood floors. He noticed the door to the home gym was slightly ajar, and as he approached, he heard the low murmur of voices. His heart pounded in his chest as he pushed the door open, revealing a scene that would be forever seared into his memory. There, in the gym, were Emily and Mark, their faces flushed with guilt and panic. The truth that Richard had dreaded for so long was now laid bare before him, and the reality of his wife's betrayal hit him like a physical blow. For a moment, the room was silent, the air thick with tension, as the three of them stood frozen, trapped in the horror of the moment. Richard's shock quickly turned to rage. His vision blurred as the blood rushed to his head, and before he could fully process what he was doing, he lunged at Mark with a ferocity that surprised even himself. "What the hell is going on here?" he shouted, his voice shaking with fury. The betrayal and anger he felt were too overwhelming to contain. Mark, caught off guard, stumbled backward as Richard advanced on him. "Richard, wait. I can explain," Mark began, but his words were cut off as Richard grabbed him by the collar, shoving him against the wall with a force that knocked the wind out of him. Emily screamed, rushing forward to try to pull Richard away, but her efforts were in vain. The anger that had been simmering inside Richard for weeks had finally boiled over, and he was beyond reason. "You think you can just waltz in here and destroy my life?" Richard spat, his voice laced with venom. "You think you can take what's mine?" Mark, his back pressed against the wall, struggled to breathe as Richard's grip tightened. Desperation fueled his actions as he fought to break free. In the chaos, his hand found the heavy dumbbell lying on the floor, and in a panic he swung it at Richard in a desperate attempt to defend himself. The dumbbell connected with Richard's head with a sickening thud, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Richard's eyes widened in shock as he staggered back, blood trickling down his forehead. He took one unsteady step, then another, before collapsing to the floor, his body crumpling in a heap. Emily's scream pierced the air as she dropped to her knees beside Richard's motionless form, her hands shaking as she tried to staunch the flow of blood. "Oh my God, Richard, please," she sobbed, her voice trembling with fear and guilt. But it was too late. The man she had once loved, the man whose life she had shared, was gone. Mark stood frozen, the dumbbell still in his hand, his mind reeling with the realization of what he had just done. The weight of his actions crashed down on him like a tidal wave, and he felt his knees buckle as the horror of the situation set in. The gym, once a place of energy and life, had become a scene of death and despair. In that moment, as Emily and Mark stared at the lifeless body of Richard Stevenson, they both knew that their lives had been irrevocably changed. The affair that had begun as a passionate escape had ended in tragedy, and there was no turning back. The consequences of their actions would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The seconds ticked by in agonizing silence as Emily and Mark stood frozen in the home gym, their minds struggling to process the reality of what had just happened. Richard Stevenson, the man who had once been the center of Emily's life, now lay lifeless on the cold floor, his blood pooling around his head. The gravity of the situation began to sink in, and with it came a wave of panic that threatened to drown them both. Emily was the first to break the silence. "We need to do something," she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably as she reached out to touch Richard's lifeless body, hoping against hope that there might still be a chance to save him. But the truth was undeniable. Richard was gone, and there was no bringing him back. Mark, still holding the dumbbell, felt a surge of nausea rise in his throat. He dropped the weight with a clatter, backing away from Richard's body as if the mere sight of it might somehow implicate him further. "Emily, what have we done?" he murmured, his voice barely audible. The reality of the situation was suffocating, and he felt like he might collapse under the weight of it. Emily's mind raced, desperate to find a solution, a way out of the nightmare they had created. She knew that if anyone found out what had happened, their lives would be over. The affair, the murder, everything would come to light, and they would both be ruined. They needed to act fast if they had any hope of escaping the consequences of their actions. "We have to cover this up," Emily said suddenly, her voice taking on a steely resolve that surprised even herself. The shock and grief that had overwhelmed her moments before were now giving way to a cold, calculated determination. "No one can ever know what happened here." Mark stared at her in disbelief, his mind struggling to keep up with the rapid turn of events. "Cover it up? How?" he asked, his voice shaking with uncertainty. The idea of hiding a murder was beyond anything he had ever imagined, and the sheer audacity of it left him reeling. Emily's eyes darted around the room as she formulated a plan. "We need to make it look like an accident," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Richard was working out. Maybe he fell and hit his head. We can clean up the blood, get rid of any evidence that you were here, and make it look like he died in a freak accident." Mark hesitated, the fear and guilt gnawing at his conscience. But he knew that Emily was right. If they didn't cover this up, they would both be facing prison, and the scandal would destroy not only their lives, but the lives of everyone around them. Reluctantly, he nodded, agreeing to go along with her plan. They sprang into action, each movement driven by a mix of desperation and fear. Emily grabbed a towel and began to wipe up the blood as best she could, while Mark hastily gathered his belongings, making sure to leave no trace of his presence behind. Every second felt like an eternity as they worked in silence, the enormity of their actions weighing heavily on their minds. Once the blood was cleaned up, Emily and Mark carefully staged the scene to look like an accidental death. They positioned Richard's body near the weight bench, placing a barbell on the floor beside him, as if it had fallen from his hands. Emily forced herself to remain calm, her hands steady as she meticulously arranged the scene to support their fabricated story. With the scene set, Emily and Mark took a final look at the room, making sure there was nothing out of place. It was a macabre tableau, and the knowledge that they had orchestrated it filled them both with a deep sense of dread. They knew that their actions had crossed a line from which there was no return. Before they left the house, Emily paused to compose herself. She knew that she needed to appear calm and collected when the authorities arrived. Any sign of distress or guilt could raise suspicion. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. "We need to call 911, she said to Mark, her voice steady. "We'll tell them that I found Richard like this when I came home." Mark nodded, his expression grim. "What if they don't believe us?" he asked, the fear evident in his voice. "They have to," Emily replied, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "We just have to stick to the story and act like nothing's wrong. We can do this." With trembling hands, Emily dialed 911 and reported the accident. She kept her voice calm and measured, giving the dispatcher the necessary details without revealing the turmoil raging inside her. When she hung up, she turned to Mark, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "We stick to the story," she repeated, as much to herself as to him. Minutes later, the wail of sirens pierced the air as paramedics and police officers arrived at the Stevenson home. Emily stood at the door, her face a mask of controlled grief as she led them to the gym. Mark slipped out of the back door, unnoticed, leaving Emily to play the role of the devastated widow. As the paramedics confirmed what Emily already knew, that Richard was dead, the police began their investigation. Emily answered their questions with practiced composure, repeating the story she and Mark had concocted. She knew that her performance had to be flawless. Any slip-up could spell disaster. But as the officers surveyed the scene and began to take notes, Emily felt a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. No matter how well they had planned, no matter how carefully they had staged the accident, she couldn't shake the feeling that something would go wrong, that the truth would find its way to the surface, and everything they had tried to hide would be exposed. The trial of Emily Stevenson and Mark Reynolds became a spectacle, drawing the attention of the media and the public alike. The courtroom was packed with reporters, curious onlookers, and those who had once called the Stevensons friends. The once private lives of Emily and Richard were now laid bare for all to see, as every detail of their marriage, the affair, and the subsequent murder was scrutinized and dissected. Emily, who had always been the epitome of grace and composure, now appeared haggard and broken. The weight of her actions, combined with the public exposure of her private life, had taken a toll on her both physically and mentally. She sat quietly in the courtroom, barely able to meet the eyes of those around her, as the prosecution laid out the case against her. Mark, too, had changed. The confident, charismatic trainer who had once captivated Emily was now a shadow of his former self. He seemed lost, as if he couldn't quite comprehend how his life had unraveled so completely. The affair that had once brought him excitement and passion had turned into a nightmare, and he knew there was no escaping the consequences of his actions. The prosecution painted a damning picture of the events leading up to Richard Stevenson's death. They detailed the affair between Emily and Mark, the growing tension between Emily and Richard, and the final, fatal confrontation in the gym. They presented the forensic evidence, the phone records, and the confessions as irrefutable proof that Richard's death had been the result of a deliberate act of violence, followed by a calculated attempt to cover up the crime. The defense, on the other hand, tried to portray the events as a tragic accident. They argued that Mark had acted in self-defense, that he had never intended to kill Richard, and that the subsequent cover-up was the result of panic and fear, not malice. They also tried to elicit sympathy for Emily, portraying her as a woman driven to desperation by a loveless marriage and a longing for connection. But the jury was not swayed by the defense's arguments. The evidence was too strong, the confessions too damning. After days of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty on all counts. Emily Stevenson was found guilty of being an accessory to murder, and Mark Reynolds was convicted of second-degree murder. As the verdict was read, the courtroom fell silent. Emily sat motionless, her face pale and expressionless, as the reality of her fate set in. Mark hung his head, the weight of the guilty verdict pressing down on him like a physical force. The trial had ended, but the consequences of their actions were just beginning. Emily was sentenced to 15 years in prison for her role in the cover-up, while Mark received a 25-year sentence for the murder of Richard Stevenson. The sentences were harsh, but they reflected the gravity of the crime and the betrayal that had led to it. As they were led away in handcuffs, the once perfect image of the Stevenson family was shattered forever. The community of Willowbrook, still reeling from the scandal, was left to pick up the pieces and move on. The Stevensons' home, once a symbol of success and stability, now stood empty, a haunting reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. Detective Laura Harris, though satisfied that justice had been served, couldn't help but feel a sense of sadness as she watched Emily and Mark being taken away. The case had been a stark reminder of the darkness that could lurk beneath the surface of even the most seemingly perfect lives. It had also highlighted the devastating consequences of betrayal and the lengths to which people would go to protect their secrets. In the weeks that followed, the story of Emily Stevenson and Mark Reynolds slowly faded from the headlines, replaced by new scandals and tragedies. But for those who had been touched by the case, the memory of what had happened in Willowbrook would linger long after the news cycle had moved on. Emily and Mark, now separated by the walls of their respective prisons, were left to reflect on the choices that had led them to this point. The affair that had once seemed so thrilling, so full of promise, had ultimately destroyed everything they held dear. Their lives were forever changed, their futures uncertain, as they faced the long years of imprisonment ahead. In the end, the story of Emily Stevenson and Mark Reynolds was a cautionary tale, a reminder of how quickly passion could turn to tragedy, and how the consequences of one's actions could reverberate far beyond what was intended. It was a story of love, betrayal, and ultimately, the price that must be paid when the truth is finally revealed. And so, the quiet streets of Willowbrook slowly returned to normal, the shadows of the past beginning to fade. But the memory of the Stevenson affair and the tragic events that followed would remain a dark chapter in the town's history, a reminder that even in the most peaceful places, darkness can find a way to seep in. Subscribe now to uncover the dark truths behind seemingly perfect lives. Don't miss our next gripping story of passion, betrayal, and the shocking consequences that follow. Hit the notification bell to stay updated on all our thrilling true crime tales.